Pinocchio. Once upon a time there was a piece of wood. It looked just like an ordinary piece of wood, such as is used in stoves and fireplaces to kindle a fire and warm the room in winter. It lay in the workshop of an old carpenter called Geppetto. One morning, Geppetto decided to make a wooden puppet. Not an ordinary wooden puppet, but a really special one that would be able to dance and do tricks and turn somersaults. So after breakfast, he collected all his woodworking tools together and started work. As he worked, he said to himself, "I think I shall call my puppet Pinocchio. It's a good name, and it'll bring him luck." Within a short time, he had made the body and the arms and the legs. Then he started on the head and completed the hair and the eyes. But as soon as he'd finished the eyes, he was very surprised to see they were looking at him and watching his every movement. After the eyes, he made the nose and the mouth, and suddenly the mouth started laughing. You can imagine Geppetto's surprise. "You're laughing. What are you laughing at?" he said. And at that, the puppet stuck its tongue out at him. Geppetto pretended not to see it and went on with his work. He finished the ears and the chin, and then he put the finishing touches to the face and the hands, and at last the puppet was complete. As he stood back to admire the finished work, the puppet suddenly snatched the wig from his head. "Pinocchio!" he shouted. "Give me back my wig at once!" But instead of giving back the wig, the puppet put it on its own head and was almost hidden under it. This cheeky behaviour made Geppetto feel very sad. "Pinocchio, you're a rascal," he said. "I made you out of an old piece of wood. I'm like a father to you. It's very naughty for a son to disobey his father in this way." Pinocchio's answer to this was to kick Geppetto hard in the shins. "Well, I suppose I've only got myself to blame," said Geppetto. "I should have known something like this might happen." He lifted the puppet and placed him on the floor to see if he could walk. But Pinocchio's legs were stiff, and he didn't know how to move them. So Geppetto led him by the hand and showed him how to put one foot in front of the other. When the stiffness went out of his legs, Pinocchio started to walk alone and run around the room. And then suddenly he slipped through the door into the street and ran away. Poor old Geppetto ran after him as quickly as he could, but he couldn't catch him. Pinocchio ran as fast as a rabbit, and his wooden feet clattered on the pavement, making as much noise as 20 pairs of wooden shoes. When the people in the street saw the wooden puppet running as fast as a racehorse, they stared in amazement, and then they laughed and laughed until their sides were aching. At last, a policeman came round the corner, and when he heard all the noise and the shouting, he thought that somebody's horse had run away. So he planted himself in the middle of the street with his legs apart in order to stop the animal as best he could. Pinocchio saw the policeman and decided to run between his legs, but the policeman was too quick for him. He picked the puppet up by his nose and handed him over to Geppetto, who came panting up at that moment. Geppetto grabbed the puppet by the scruff of his neck and said, "You naughty boy, you just wait until I get you home. I'll show you what happens to boys who play tricks on their poor old fathers." Quite a crowd had gathered by this time, and when they heard old Geppetto's words, they began to mutter among themselves. "That poor puppet," said one of them. "No wonder he's trying to run away from home. He must have a terrible time of it with that old man." "Geppetto seems to be a good man," said a second voice, "but he's a perfect tyrant with children. If we leave that poor puppet in his hands, goodness knows what will happen to him." The policeman listened carefully to these remarks, and in the end he said to Geppetto, "I think you'd better come along with me, sir. I'd like to ask you a few questions down at the police station." As he was led away, Geppetto muttered to himself, "And to think I worked so hard to make a fine puppet. Oh, well, it serves me right, I suppose. I might have known something like this would happen." As soon as Geppetto and the policeman had disappeared, Pinocchio ran home across the fields as quickly as possible. When he arrived at home, he found the door ajar. Pushing it open, he went in and locked it securely behind him. Then he laughed and sang merrily to himself, and danced happily around the room. he didn't feel at all bad about what had happened to his poor old father. After a while he became quite tired out, so he sat down on a chair to rest. Suddenly a funny little voice called out, "Hey, Pinocchio!" "Who's there?" he said in alarm. "Who's calling me?" "I am," said the voice. Pinocchio glanced up and saw a big cricket sitting on the wall. "Who are you?" he said in surprise. "I'm a talking cricket," said the cricket. "I've lived in this room for over 100 years. "Well, I live here now," said Pinocchio rudely, "so kindly go away and don't come back." "I've got something to tell you first," said the cricket. "Well, be quick about it then," said the puppet. "Boys who revolt against their parents and run away from home always come to a bad end," said the cricket, "and sooner or later they're very sorry for what they've done." "Is that so?" said Pinocchio. "Well, you can say what you please, Mr. Cricket, but as for me, tomorrow at sunrise I am going to leave, because if I stay, the same thing will happen to me as happens to other boys. I shall be sent to school, and nobody's going to make me study books and learn lessons." "You know what's going to happen to you," said the cricket. "You're going to grow up to be a donkey, and everyone will make fun of you." "Be quiet, you good-for-nothing croaking old cricket," shouted Pinocchio. The cricket, who was very patient and something of a philosopher, didn't take offence. He said, "If you don't want to go to school, why don't you learn a trade so that you'll be able to earn an honest living?" "Shall I tell you something?" said Pinocchio. "Of all the trades in the world, there's only one which really attracts me." "What's that?" said the cricket. "To eat, drink, sleep, and amuse myself from morning to night," laughed Pinocchio. "Let me tell you," said the cricket, "that those who follow that trade always finish up in one of two places, hospital or prison." "Now you're beginning to make me angry," shouted Pinocchio. "Poor Pinocchio," said the cricket. "I feel really sorry for you." "Sorry for me?" said Pinocchio. "Why?" "Because you have a wooden head," said the cricket. At these words, Pinocchio lost his temper, and seizing a large hammer from the workbench, he threw it at the cricket. Luckily for the cricket, his aim was bad. The hammer missed him by inches, but he was so frightened that he flew off through the open window and out into the street. Pinocchio was immediately ashamed at what he had done, and he sat down in front of the fire, thinking to himself that although he had not been long in this world, he had already behaved very badly to two people, the poor carpenter, Geppetto, and the unfortunate cricket. After a while he fell asleep. He woke up suddenly some time later to hear the sound of a loud knocking on the door. He got up quickly and unlocked the door to find Geppetto standing outside. "Oh, there you are," said the old man. "What a time I've had of it. You've certainly got me into a deal of trouble with your naughtiness, Pinocchio." "I'm sorry, Father," said the puppet. "I didn't mean any harm. I'll try to be good in future." "All right," said old Geppetto. "I'll overlook it this time. Are you hungry?" "Oh, yes," said Pinocchio. "Well, there's very little food in the house, I'm afraid," said Geppetto. "In fact, there's nothing at all but some old pears which I found lying in the street. I was going to have them for breakfast, but if you're hungry, you can have them." He took 3 pears out of his pocket and laid them on the table. "If you expect me to eat those, you'll have to peel them for me," said Pinocchio. "Peel them for you?" said Geppetto, astonished. "Well, I didn't realize that you were so fastidious. You'd better get used to eating anything you can get hold of, my lad." "I can't possibly eat fruit that hasn't been peeled," said the puppet. "I can't stand skins." With a sigh, old Geppetto took out a kitchen knife and carefully peeled the 3 pears, putting all the peelings on the corner of the table. Pinocchio gobbled up the pears in double-quick time. He was about to throw away the cores when Geppetto said, "Don't throw them away. You might be glad of those later on." He placed the 3 cores on the table with the peelings, but Pinocchio said indignantly, "You don't think I'm going to eat the cores, do you?" "Who knows?" replied Geppetto. "This is a curious world." Pinocchio frowned. "I'm still hungry," he said grumpily. "There's nothing else to eat," said the carpenter, "except, of course—" "Except what?" said Pinocchio. "Except the peelings and the cores from the pears," said Geppetto. As Pinocchio was still feeling very hungry indeed, he said reluctantly, "Oh, all right, if there's absolutely nothing else." He began to eat the peelings and the cores. At first he screwed up his face in distaste, but he continued eating until at last he had finished every scrap. Then he patted his stomach and said, "Ah, I feel better now." "You see," said Geppetto, "I was right when I said you should not be so fastidious about your food." "Yes, father, you were right," said Pinocchio. "I shall always listen to you in future, and to prove how grateful I am, tomorrow I shall go to school." "Excellent," said old Geppetto. "I'm very glad to hear that you're starting off on the right foot." "But of course," continued Pinocchio, "if I'm going to go to school, I shall have to have some clothes." "Of course you must," said old Geppetto. Now the old carpenter hadn't any money to buy clothes with, so instead he made the puppet a suit out of flowered paper, a pair of shoes from the bark of a tree, and a cap out of an old cardboard box. Pinocchio ran to look at himself in the mirror, and he was so pleased with himself that he said as he strutted round the room, "I look a proper gentleman." "Yes, indeed," said Geppetto, "but remember, fine clothes don't make a gentleman." "By the way," said Pinocchio, "there's something else I shall need if I'm going to school, the most necessary thing of all." "What's that?" said the old man. "School books," said the puppet. "Ah, yes, of course," said Geppetto, "but I'm afraid I don't have any money to buy them with." "Oh, well, that's it then," said Pinocchio. "If I don't have any school book—" "Now, wait a minute," said Geppetto. "Don't be too hasty. I've got an idea." He took down his old coat from behind the door and put it on. It was so old and so full of holes and patches that it was practically falling to pieces. Geppetto opened the door and walked out. It was a very cold afternoon. The wind was blowing strongly, and it was beginning to snow. Within half an hour he returned with a dozen school books under his arm, but this time he was in his shirt-sleeves and shivering with cold. "Father," said Pinocchio, "where's your coat?" "I sold it," said the old man. "Look, here are your school books." Pinocchio, when he realized the sacrifice that Geppetto had made, threw his arms around the old man's neck and hugged him. The next morning, Pinocchio set out for school with his new books under his arm. "At school today," he said to himself as he walked along, "I shall learn to read. Tomorrow I shall learn to write, and the day after tomorrow I shall learn all the figures. Then I shall be clever enough to earn lots of money, and the first thing I am going to do is buy my father a nice new coat. It shall be a gold and silver coat with diamond buttons." As he walked along to school, talking to himself happily, he suddenly heard the sound of music in the distance. He stopped and listened. Yes, it was definitely music. He could make out a fife and several drums. The sounds were coming from the end of the street that crossed the one which led to the school, down near the end of the village. "I wonder what it is," he thought to himself. What a pity I have to go to school. I wonder if I have time just to find out what's going on. Yes, why not? I can go to school tomorrow. Today I shall find out where this music is coming from and what's happening. He set off at a run down the street towards the music. At last he came to a little square full of people. They were gathered around a showman's booth made of boards and cloth, painted in all the colours of the rainbow. Pinocchio stopped and stared, fascinated. He pushed his way through the excited crowd until he came out in front of the booth. Several musicians stood in front of it, playing pipes and drums. Pinocchio turned to a boy standing next to him. "What's going on?" he said. "What is this building?" "It's all there on the poster," said the boy. "Why don't you read it for yourself?" "I haven't learnt to read yet," said Pinocchio. "I'm going to do that tomorrow." The boy laughed. "I'll read it for you," he said. "It says, 'Grand Puppet Show.' It's just about to start." "How much does it cost to go in?" asked Pinocchio. "Twopence," said the boy. "Will you lend me twopence until tomorrow?" said the puppet. "I'd simply love to," said the boy. "Unfortunately, I can't today because I haven't got twopence with me." "I'll sell you my jacket for twopence," said Pinocchio. "I've just told you I haven't got twopence," said the boy. "What about my shoes, then?" said Pinocchio. "I wouldn't buy those even if I had twopence," said the boy. "Well, what will you give me for my cap?" asked the puppet. "Can't you get it into your head?" shouted the boy. "I haven't got any money." "I'll tell you what," said Pinocchio. "You can have these school books for twopence. They're all brand new." The boy was just about to punch Pinocchio in the nose when an old clothes dealer who had overheard the conversation spoke up. "I'll give you twopence for your school books," he said. And without a thought for poor old Geppetto shivering in his shirt sleeves, Pinocchio handed over his school books and grabbed the twopence. He hurried up to the entrance to the booth and handed over his money and went inside. When he got inside, the curtain was up and the play had just started. Harlequin and Punchinello were on the stage, quarrelling as usual and threatening to come to blows at any moment. The audience were laughing until their sides ached at the sight of the two puppets shouting and shaking their fists and calling each other names, just as if they were two real persons. But all at once Harlequin stopped and stared down at the audience. Then he pointed and shouted dramatically, "Look, everybody! Pinocchio's here!" "So he is!" cried Punchinello. Immediately all the puppets on the stage rushed to the footlights, shouting, "It's Pinocchio! There he is, our brother Pinocchio!" "Come up here, Pinocchio!" shouted Harlequin. "Come up onto the stage where we can all see you." Pinocchio needed no further invitation. He made a jump from the back of the pit to the front seats. And from there he made another jump and landed on the head of the orchestra leader. And from there he jumped right onto the stage. It is impossible to describe the hugging and kissing that followed, the friendly pinches, the brotherly taps that Pinocchio received from the actors and actresses of that puppet company. It was a very spectacular and moving sight, but unfortunately the audience, when they saw that the play had stopped, grew impatient and began stamping and shouting. "Get on with the play!" they roared. "We want to see the play!" But the puppets on the stage took no notice. They placed Pinocchio on their shoulders and carried him round and round the stage in triumph. And then, suddenly, the showman appeared at the back of the theatre. The whole theatre and all the puppets belonged to him, and everyone was afraid of him. He was certainly a frightening sight. He was very, very tall and very, very ugly. His beard was as black as ink, and it was so long that it reached right down to the ground. In fact, he was always tripping over it. His mouth was as big as an oven. His eyes were like two burning red lanterns, and he was constantly cracking a great whip made of foxes' tails twisted together. When the showman appeared so unexpectedly, everybody fell silent. No one dared breathe. The puppets trembled like autumn leaves. The showman glared angrily at Pinocchio. "Why have you come here to disturb my theatre?" he shouted. "It wasn't my fault, sir," stammered Pinocchio. "Not another word," said the showman. "I'll settle accounts with you tonight." He stormed onto the stage and grabbed Pinocchio by the scruff of the neck. Then he dragged him out of the theatre and over to the house where he was staying on the other side of the square. He bundled him into the kitchen, locked the door, and went off back to the theatre where the performance had now resumed. As soon as the show was over, the showman and all the puppets went back to the house across the square. They all went into the kitchen, where the showman's dinner was roasting over the fire on a slowly turning spit. It was a whole sheep. When the showman saw that there was not enough wood to finish roasting the sheep, he called Harlequin and Punchinello and said, "Fetch Pinocchio over here. He's made of nice dry wood. I'm sure he'll make a good fire for my roast." At first, Harlequin and Punchinello hesitated, but when they saw the expression on the showman's face, they went and fetched Pinocchio. The puppet wriggled like an eel and shouted desperately, "I don't want to die! I don't want to die!" Now the showman was really not so bad at heart, and when he saw Pinocchio struggling and crying, he felt sorry for him, and although he tried hard not to, he sneezed violently. Harlequin whispered to Pinocchio, "That's a good sign. He sneezed. You're going to be all right." You see, while other men weep or at least pretend to wipe their eyes when they feel sorry for somebody, whenever the showman really pitied anyone, he sneezed. However, he didn't want to show any signs of softness, so he shouted at Pinocchio, "Can't you stop crying? It gives me a nasty feeling in my stomach. In fact, I feel another sneeze coming on. And this time he sneezed twice. "God bless you," said Pinocchio. "Thank you," said the showman. "You're very kind. Tell me, are your father and mother alive?" "My father is," said Pinocchio, "but I haven't got a mother." "Well," said the showman, "I suppose your poor old father would be upset if I threw you on the fire. So and he sneezed 3 times. "Bless you," said Pinocchio. "Thank you," said the showman. "But look at it from my point of view. As you can see, there isn't enough wood to keep the fire going so that my mutton will be properly roasted. So you would certainly have come in very handy there. But I can see that it would be very bad manners to throw you on the fire, so I shall have to think of something else. So I throw the Harlequin on the fire instead." When the poor Harlequin heard this, he was so frightened that his legs buckled under him and he fell flat on his face. Pinocchio immediately threw himself on his knees before the showman and burst into tears again. In less time than it takes to tell, the showman's beard was wet through. "Please don't throw the Harlequin on the fire, sir," he said with a sob in his voice. "It's the only thing I can do," said the showman. "I've spared you from the flames, and I must get some wood from somewhere, otherwise my dinner will be half cooked." "In that case," said Pinocchio bravely, "I know my duty. Throw me in the fire. It's not right that poor Harlequin, my best friend, my only friend, should die for me." When he heard this, the showman sneezed violently 5 times. Then he picked Pinocchio up in his arms and hugged him and said, "You're a brave, good boy. Come here and give me a kiss." Pinocchio grabbed the showman's beard and gave him a loud kiss on the tip of his nose. "Does this mean my life is spared?" asked Harlequin in a trembling voice. "Yes, I suppose it does," said the showman. "I shall have to eat my dinner half-cooked tonight." When they heard this news, all the puppets gave a cheer and danced round the room with joy. The next morning, the The showman called Pinocchio aside and asked him, "What is your father's name?" "Geppetto," said the puppet. "And what is his trade?" asked the showman. "He's a carpenter," said Pinocchio. "Does he earn very much?" asked the showman. "No," said Pinocchio. "He earns practically nothing at all. He had to sell his only coat to buy school books for me." "Poor fellow," said the showman. "Look, here are 5 gold pieces. Hurry home now and give them to him with my compliments." Pinocchio was delighted, and he thanked the showman 1,000 times over. Then he shook hands with the Harlequin and all the other puppets and ran home as fast as he could. But he hadn't got very far when he met a fox and a cat. The fox was lame in one foot, and the cat was blind in both eyes. They were getting along together as best they could, the lame fox leaning on the blind cat, and the blind cat being guided by the lame fox. "Good morning, Pinocchio," said the fox politely. "How do you know my name?" asked the puppet. "Oh, I know who you are," said the fox. "I know your father very well." "Where did you see him?" asked Pinocchio. "I saw him only yesterday at the gate of his house." "What was he doing?" asked the puppet. "He was leaning on the gate in his shirt sleeves, trembling with cold. I think he was looking for you." "Oh dear," said Pinocchio. "Poor father. But never mind. From now on he won't ever be cold again." "Oh," said the fox. "And why is that?" "Because I am now a rich man," said Pinocchio. "Ha ha! A rich man? You?" said the fox with a scornful laugh. "Yes, me," said Pinocchio rather crossly. "I can see that you don't believe me. Well, just take a look at this." And he pulled from his pocket the 5 gold pieces that the showman had given him. When he saw the gold glinting in the sunlight, the fox made an involuntary movement with his paw, almost as though he intended to grab the money out of Pinocchio's hand. He stopped himself just in time, and then, in his excitement, he gave a little hop and a skip, and suddenly, just for a moment, he didn't seem to be lame at all. At the same moment, the cat, when Pinocchio showed the gold pieces, opened wide her 2 blind eyes, but she shut them again so quickly that Pinocchio didn't notice. "Well, well, well," said the fox quietly. "So you really are a rich man. Now tell me, sonny, what are you going to do with all that money?" "Well, first of all," said the puppet, "I shall buy a beautiful new coat for my father, a coat made of gold and silver and with diamond buttons. And then I'm going to buy myself some new school books. I'm going to school today, and I'm going to study hard so that I shall be able to earn enough money to keep my poor old father in comfort." "Well," said the fox, "that's very commendable, I'm sure. But now, look here, Pinocchio," and he put one arm around the puppet's shoulder and looked furtively behind him to see if anyone was listening. "What would you say if I told you that I know a way for you to increase your fortune?" "Increase my fortune?" said Pinocchio. "What do you mean?" "How would you like," whispered the fox, "to multiply those 5 gold pieces 100, 1,000, even 2,000 times?" "I'd like it very much," said Pinocchio, "but how could I do that?" "It's really quite simple," said the fox. "Now, mind, we wouldn't tell just anybody the secret, but we've taken rather a fancy to you, haven't we, pussy?" "Oh, yes," said the cat silkily, "we certainly have." "Well, then," said the fox, "have you ever heard of a place called the Field of Miracles?" "No, I haven't," said Pinocchio. "Not a lot of people have," said the fox. "You see, it's a magic field, and what you do is this. You dig a little hole in the middle of the field, and you put a gold piece in the hole. Then you cover it with earth, pour some water over it, sprinkle on 2 pinches of salt, then go quietly home and go to bed." "And then what happens?" said Pinocchio. "Well," said the fox, "during the night the gold piece will grow and blossom, and the next morning, when you get up and go back to the field, you'll find that a marvellous magic tree has sprung up, laden with as many gold pieces as an ear of corn has grains at harvest time. "You're pulling my leg," said Pinocchio. "It's as true as I'm standing here with a lame leg," said the fox. "Well, suppose," said Pinocchio, "that I buried my 5 gold pieces in that field. How many should I find there the next morning?" "Every single gold piece," replied the fox, "should yield 500. So if you multiply 500 by 5, the next morning you should find 2,500 shining gold pieces on that tree." 2,500 gold pieces, said Pinocchio. "But that's incredible. Are you sure you've got your sums right?" "Of course I'm sure," said the fox. "Well, what about it?" "Where is this field of miracles?" asked Pinocchio. "Oh, it's not very far," said the fox. "We can show you the way without any bother." "Well, what are we waiting for?" exclaimed Pinocchio. "Let's go." "Just a minute," said the fox. "What are you going to do with this fortune when you've got it?" "I shall keep 2,000 pieces of gold for myself and my father," said Pinocchio, "and I shall make you a present of the other 500. "A present?" said the fox in an offended tone of voice. "Good heavens! We don't want any of it for ourselves, do we, pussy?" "Certainly not," said the cat. "That's the last thing we want." "We're not doing this to get anything out of it," said the fox. "We're doing it to help you. We like helping deserving cases. It's in our nature." "Well," said Pinocchio, "that is kind of you. What a pleasure it is to find such generous people in the world. I really don't know how to thank you." "That's quite unnecessary, my boy," said the fox. "How far did you say it was to this field of miracles?" said Pinocchio. "It's a couple of miles from here," said the fox, "on the other side of the village. You should be there in half an hour. Cat knows the way, don't you, pussy?" "I thought the cat was blind," said Pinocchio. "Blind?" said the fox. "Oh, blind! Oh, yes, of course, yes. I didn't mean the cat would actually lead the way. What I meant was that, well, we mustn't stand here gossiping. You've got a fortune waiting for you. Come on, let's be on our way." And so Pinocchio and the fox and the cat set off for the field of miracles, and the puppet laughed and sang happily. About half an hour later, they came to a field that looked to Pinocchio just like any other field. "Here we are," said the fox, "the field of miracles. Now get to work at once and dig a small hole with your hands, and then bury your 5 gold pieces." Pinocchio quickly dug a small hole in the earth, dropped his 5 gold pieces into it, and covered them over. "Now then," said the fox, "there's a small stream over there, and nearby you'll find an old bucket. Fill the bucket with water, bring it back here, and water the ground where you have planted your gold." Pinocchio ran over to the stream, and sure enough, there was an old bucket lying on the bank. Quickly he filled it with water from the brook, hurried back, and emptied the water over the spot where he had buried his 5 gold pieces. Then he said, "What else must I do?" "Nothing else," answered the fox. "We must go away now. Since you've emptied a whole bucket of water over the gold, the tree should spring up very quickly indeed, so you come back in about 20 minutes. The puppet was beside himself with joy, and he thanked the fox and the cat 1,000 times, and again promised them a lovely present. "We don't want any presents," protested the 2 scoundrels. "It's quite enough for us to have shown you how to get rich without hard work." With these words they said good-bye to Pinocchio, and wishing him a splendid harvest, they walked off over the fields and disappeared from sight. Pinocchio wondered what he should do while he was waiting for the tree to grow. He thought he had better go off somewhere out of sight of the place where he had buried his gold, but it was too far to go back home. So he walked along a path that led out of the field of miracles and on up towards a small hill covered with trees and bushes. When he reached the top, he sat down under the shade of a large oak tree and composed himself to wait. He started to try to count off the minutes, but the counting and the warm sun beating down on him soon made him sleepy, and in a few moments he was fast asleep. He awoke with a start, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered and got to his feet quickly. How long had he been asleep? He had no idea. But the sun was certainly in a different place now to the one it had been when he sat down. Surely the 20 minutes must have gone by now. He hurried down the hill and ran back to the Field of Miracles. He ran as fast as he could, with his heart beating like a grandfather clock, and while he ran he talked to himself. "I wonder if it's possible that I might find even more gold pieces on the tree than the fox said," he muttered. "What if I find 5,000 gold pieces, or 10,000, or perhaps even 20,000? Then I'll really be a gentleman. I'll have a magnificent palace, and 1,000 ponies, and 1,000 stables to put them in, and a cellar full of ice cream, and cakes, and lemonade." Trying to run and talk at the same time made Pinocchio out of breath, so he stopped talking and concentrated on running. At last he came to the Field of Miracles, and he ran eagerly out into the middle of it, and then stopped, panting, and looked around him. There was no sign of a magic tree, nor of anything that looked remotely like a magic tree. He found the spot where he had buried the gold pieces. The earth had been thrown aside, and he bent down to look into the hole. It was empty. There was no sign of his gold. He stood up and looked around, puzzled. He just couldn't understand what had happened. And at that moment a pigeon, which had been circling around, flew down and alighted on the ground in front of him. The pigeon looked hard at Pinocchio, and then at the hole in the ground. Then it laughed loud and long. "What are you laughing at?" shouted Pinocchio angrily. "I'm laughing to think that there are so many simpletons in the world," said the pigeon. "Are you suggesting that I'm a simpleton?" said Pinocchio. "I certainly am," said the pigeon with a chuckle. "You're so simple that you think you can plant money in the ground and come back and collect the harvest just as if it was beans or pumpkins. You're such a simpleton that you don't even know that there's only one way to earn money honestly, and that's by the labor of your hands or your brains." "Do you mean to say that what the fox told me about the Field of Miracles and the magic tree wasn't true?" said Pinocchio. "Field of Miracles," said the pigeon. "Magic tree? Oh dear, 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 oh dear. Don't you understand yet? There is no Field of Miracles. There is no magic tree. There never has been. While you were asleep, the fox and the cat came back and dug up your gold. They're probably miles away by now. You'll never see your money again." And chuckling to himself, the pigeon took off and disappeared into the distance, leaving a very dejected Pinocchio standing in the middle of the empty field. It took a few moments for Pinocchio to realize just how foolish he had been and how cleverly he had been tricked by the fox and the cat. When at last he knew that his 5 gold pieces were well and truly lost and gone forever, he walked sadly out of the field and set off for home. As he trudged along, it began to grow darker, and after a while he felt a few drops of rain falling on his head. He hurried along faster, but very soon the rain began to come down quite heavily. As he ran, he thought to himself, "I've really learnt my lesson this time. From now on, I shall lead a very different life. I shall go to school and work very hard and do everything my father tells me." The rain was pouring down in sheets by this time. It was rapidly growing dark as the sun set behind the distant hills. Pinocchio came to a small gate leading into the fields, and he recognized this as a short-cut to the village where he lived. He turned off the road and plunged into the field, running and stumbling as best he could. It was now raining so heavily that the field was a sea of mud, and the puppet began to run slower and slower as the mud made it harder for him to lift his feet. And then suddenly, just as he was halfway across the field, there was a loud crack, and his left leg was gripped by an iron trap. He fell heavily to the ground while a terrible pain ran up his leg. Pinocchio did not know it, but the trap had been put there by a farmer who owned the field. He wanted to try to catch some big polecats who had been terrorizing all the poultry yards nearby and stealing the chickens. As Pinocchio lay there in the muddy field with the rain pouring down, he suddenly saw a dark figure looming up over him. It was the farmer, who had come to see if he had caught a polecat in the trap. The farmer had a lantern, and he held it down so that the light shone full on the puppet's face. The man gave an exclamation of surprise when he saw what he had caught. "Aha!" he said angrily. "You little thief! It's you been eating my chickens, is it? Well, I've caught you now." "I don't know what you're talking about," sobbed Pinocchio. "Please let me out of this trap." The farmer opened the trap, seized Pinocchio by the scruff of the neck, and carried him off through the night towards a big farmhouse that stood some way back from the road. When he reached the yard in front of the farmhouse, the farmer threw Pinocchio down on the ground and said, "Now I'm going to bed. I'll deal with you in the morning. Meanwhile, as my watchdog died today, you shall take his place." He took a heavy collar covered with sharp brass studs out of his pocket and fastened it round Pinocchio's neck, so tightly that the puppet could hardly breathe. Then he fixed the collar to a long iron chain, the other end of which was fastened to the wall of the farmhouse. "If it rains tonight," said the farmer, "you can crawl into the kennel there and lie down. There's some straw in there for you to sleep on. My poor old watchdog used that kennel for 4 years, so it should be good enough for you. And remember, stay alert. If anyone comes prowling around during the night, don't forget to bark." "Bark!" cried Pinocchio. "But I'm not a dog. I'm a boy, and I—" The farmer had already gone into the farmhouse, slamming the door behind him. Pinocchio lay in the yard more dead than alive, cold, hungry, and frightened. He tried again to loosen the collar around his neck, but it was far too tight. "Well, I suppose this serves me right," he thought to himself. "If only I'd been a good boy, if only I'd been willing to study and to work, if I'd stayed at home with my poor father, I would not be here now, working as a watchdog." He crawled miserably into the kennel, lay down on the straw, and at last fell asleep. He had been sleeping soundly for several hours when, about midnight, he was wakened by the sound of strange voices that seemed to come from the yard. He stuck his nose out of the kennel and saw the shapes of 4 animals. They had very dark fur, and they looked at first like large cats. In fact, they were polecats, meat-eating animals that are especially fond of eggs and young chickens. One of them, leaving his companions and coming across to the kennel, said quietly, "Melampo, are you in there?" "My name is not Melampo," said the puppet. "Who are you then?" asked the polecat. "I'm Pinocchio," said the puppet. "What are you doing in the kennel?" "I'm the watchdog," said Pinocchio. "But where is Melampo?" said the cat. "Where's the old dog that used to live in this kennel?" "He died yesterday." "Oh dear, the poor beast. He was so kind-hearted. However, judging by your looks, you seem to be a good-natured dog too." "Excuse me," said Pinocchio indignantly. "I am not a dog." "Oh, what are you then?" said the polecat. "I'm a puppet." "A puppet?" said the polecat in surprise. "But you're acting as a watchdog." "Yes," said Pinocchio, "as a punishment." "Well, we might make the same bargain with you that we made with old Melampo. I'm sure our conditions will satisfy you." "And what might they be?" asked Pinocchio. "We shall come to the poultry yard 1 night a week, as we have done in the past, and we shall carry off 8 chickens. We shall eat 7 and give you 1, on condition that you pretend to be asleep when we are here and never bark or wake up the farmer." "Is that what Melampo did?" "Yes, indeed, and we always got on splendidly together. Now you go back to sleep, and we'll bring you a chicken for your breakfast, ready plucked. Do we understand each other?" "I understand only too clearly," said Pinocchio. So the 4 polecats went through to the poultry yard, which was quite close to the kennel. They opened the wooden door with their teeth and claws and slipped inside, one after the other. But as soon as they were all inside, the door shut behind them with a bang. Pinocchio had crept up behind them, unnoticed, and slammed the door shut as soon as they were all inside, and to make quite sure, he rolled a big stone against it so they couldn't possibly escape. And then he started to bark, just like a dog, and as loudly as he could. When the farmer heard the noise, he jumped out of bed and grabbed his gun. He threw open the bedroom window and shouted, "What's going on?" "It's the thieves," Pinocchio shouted back. "They're in the poultry yard." "I'm coming right down," yelled the farmer, and he rushed downstairs and out of the front door. He grabbed a large sack from a nail on the wall as he ran, and when he reached the poultry yard, he rolled away the big stone and went inside. Quick as a flash, he grabbed the polecats and stuffed them into the sack, crying, "Got you at last, you thieves!" Then he patted Pinocchio on the head and said, "How did you discover them? Old Melampo never was able to see a thing." Pinocchio thought to himself, "Poor old Melampo's dead and gone. What good would it do if I told the truth about him?" So he simply said, "I was fast asleep, but they woke me up with their loud voices. One of them even came up to the kennel and said, 'If you promise not to bark or wake up the farmer, we'll make you a present of one of the chickens we're going to steal.' Can you imagine it?" "Good for you, my boy," said the farmer, patting him on the shoulder. "I'm proud of you, and to show you how grateful I am, I shall give you back your freedom." And with those words he removed the collar from around Pinocchio's neck. The puppet spent the rest of the night in a nice warm barn, on a lovely soft bed of clean straw. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, and with the farmer's thanks once again ringing in his ears, he set off across the fields for home. The sun was shining brightly with the promise of a warm day, and Pinocchio was in high spirits. As he walked, his mind was full of good resolutions. He was going to go to school, he was going to work hard, he was going to look after his father and do everything that the old man told him to do. At last he arrived in the village and hurried down the street until he came to Geppetto's house. But when he got there, he had the shock of his life. The front door was securely locked and bolted. There was no smoke coming from the chimney and no sign of life anywhere. He knocked loudly for several minutes, but there was absolutely no sound from inside the house. Pinocchio sat down on the front doorstep and put his head in his hands. Where was Geppetto? What was he going to do now? Suddenly he heard the beating of wings, and the next instant a pigeon landed in the street before him. He looked up and recognized the bird. It was the same one he had spoken to in the Field of Miracles. "Hallo," said the pigeon. "So we meet again. What seems to be the trouble?" "I've just got home," said Pinocchio. "The house is locked and bolted. Do you by any chance know where my father is?" "If you mean Geppetto," said the pigeon, "I do indeed know where he is. He's gone down to the coast." "Whatever for?" asked Pinocchio in surprise. "He's looking for you," answered the pigeon. "When you didn't come back, he went out in search of you. He couldn't find you anywhere, and for some reason he's convinced you've sailed away across the sea. So he's made a little boat, and he's going to set off to find you." "But this is terrible," exclaimed the puppet. "I must go after him at once, before he sets sail. How far is it from here to the coast?" "About 50 miles," said the pigeon. 50 miles!" exclaimed Pinocchio. "How on earth am I going to get there, then? I wish I had wings like you." "Well, if you want, I could carry you," said the pigeon. "Oh, would you?" said Pinocchio. "I'd be very grateful." "Are you very heavy?" asked the bird. "Oh, no," said the puppet. "I'm as light as a feather." "Come on, then," said the pigeon. "Hop on my back, and we'll start right away. No use hanging about here." Pinocchio jumped up immediately and climbed onto the pigeon's back. The pigeon flew straight up into the air, for the puppet was indeed, fortunately, very light, and in no time at all they were high up in the sky, almost touching the clouds. Pinocchio glanced down, but when he saw the ground far, far below him, he became frightened and dizzy, and he wrapped his arms tightly around the pigeon's neck and clung on for dear life. And so they flew on for quite a long time, until at last the pigeon said, "I don't know about you, but I'm getting thirsty." "So am I," said Pinocchio, "and hungry too." "Well, let's stop for a moment," said the pigeon. "There's a dovecot down there. I'm sure we'll be able to get something to eat and drink." So down they flew to the dovecot, and when they got there they found it was deserted. Inside there was a basin of water and a basket full of green seed. Now Pinocchio had never in his life eaten green seed, but he was so hungry that he tucked in with a will, and in no time at all the basket was empty. "Well," he said, "I'd never believed that green seed could taste so good." "You've a lot to learn, my lad," said the pigeon. "When you're really hungry and there's nothing else to eat, even green seed is delicious. Hunger is the best cook." Pinocchio climbed onto the pigeon's back again, and and away they went towards the faraway sea, which was just beginning to be faintly visible in the distance. When they arrived on the shore, Pinocchio clambered down off the pigeon's back and said, "Thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful for your help." "Think nothing of it," said the bird. "I do hope you find your father. I'm afraid I can't stop. I've got quite a lot of things to do." And with that, the bird flew off and soared high into the sky. Pinocchio watched him until he had disappeared from view, and then turned and walked down to the beach. When he reached the sands, he found there was a great crowd of people there, and all of them were staring out to sea and talking and chattering excitedly. Pinocchio went up to an old woman and said, "What's going on?" "A poor father has lost his son," she replied, "and he's built a small boat and set off to find him. There he is, out there. Do you see him? But I'm afraid he's not going to get very far in this sea. Just look at the size of those waves." Pinocchio looked in the direction in which the old woman was pointing. Then he gave a shout. "It's Geppetto! It's my father!" Although the boat was quite a long way off, the puppet could make out the figure standing up in it, and it was indeed his father. The boat, which looked from this distance as small as a nutshell, was being tossed all over the place by the great waves. Sometimes it disappeared completely, and then suddenly there it was again, perched on top of a great wave. Pinocchio ran quickly to the top of a high rock and called his father by name as loudly as he could, and at the same time he took out his handkerchief and waved it frantically. Although Geppetto was very far away, he seemed to recognize his son, for he waved with his cap and shouted. His words were carried away by the wind, but it seemed as though he was trying to return to land. Unfortunately, the sea was so rough that he found it impossible to use his oars, and then suddenly a huge wave, much bigger than any of the others, completely engulfed the tiny boat, and it disappeared from sight. Everybody waited for it to appear again, but this time there was no sign of it. "Poor man," said a fisherman standing close by. "I'm afraid he's done for. He hasn't a hope." And then the crowd saw Pinocchio hurl himself off the rock into the sea. "I'll save him!" he cried. "I'll save my father!" Now Pinocchio, as you will remember, was made of wood, so he floated easily, and he swam out to sea as easily as a fish. The crowd saw him disappear under the water, beaten about by the waves. Then up he popped again, swimming strongly towards the little boat. He disappeared again, and the watching crowd caught glimpses of an arm or a leg as the puppet ploughed through the waves. But then they saw him no more, and everybody turned sadly away and left the beach. "Poor boy," said the fisherman, "he's gone too." But Pinocchio was still swimming towards Geppetto's little boat. He couldn't see it, but he didn't give up, and to make matters worse, a storm was now blowing up. The rain started to pour down like a flood. The waves rose higher and higher, and the thunder roared. Great flashes of lightning lit up the sky. Pinocchio swam and swam until at last the land disappeared from view, and now he began to get tired, and still there was no sign of his father. All night long he swam, and then at last, towards morning, he saw in the distance a long strip of land. It wasn't the beach he had started out from so long ago, but an island many miles out to sea. He tried desperately to reach the shore, but the tumbling waves tossed him everywhere, and as if he were a straw or a stick. And then at last a huge wave picked him up and carried him to the beach. He struck the shore with such force that all his ribs and joints rattled, and as he lay there, panting and exhausted, the clouds slowly cleared away. The sun came out in all its splendor, and the sea became as quiet and as smooth as oil. Pinocchio looked over the huge expanse of water to see if he could see Geppetto in his boat, but all he could see was the sky and the ocean and some seagulls wheeling about overhead. The idea of being all alone on a strange island made him feel very sad indeed. And then, suddenly, he saw a big fish swimming close into the shore. Since he did not know its name, he called out, "Hello, Mr. Fish! May I have a word with you?" "Certainly," replied the fish. "2 or 3, if you like." He was a dolphin and very polite. "Would you be so kind as to tell me if there are inhabited places on this island?" said Pinocchio.
"Oh, yes," answered the Dolphin. "There's a small town not very far from here."
"How do I get there?" said the puppet.
"Take the path on your left and follow your nose," said the Dolphin. "You can't miss it."
"Thank you," said Pinocchio. "Tell me, you swim in the sea all day. Have you by any chance seen a small boat with an old man in it?"
"No, I haven't," replied the fish. "But after that storm we had last night, I should think it's probably sunk by now, and if that's the case, I should imagine that the old man has been eaten by the whale."
"What whale?" said Pinocchio.
"Don't you know about the whale?" said the Dolphin. "He's a monster. He's been spreading death and misery in these waters for a long time."
"How big is he?" asked Pinocchio.
"He's larger than a 5-story house, and his mouth is so wide and deep that it would easily hold a train, engine and all."
"Oh dear," said Pinocchio. "Poor old Geppetto. Well, thank you, Mr. Fish. You've been very helpful." Then the puppet hurried down the little path in search of the town which the Dolphin had mentioned. He had travelled about half an hour when, emerging from a small wood, he came upon the town, nestling in a small valley. The streets were crowded with people rushing to and fro. They all seemed to be very busy, and everybody had something to do. You could not have found an idler or a tramp if you had searched with a lamp. "I don't much like the look of this place," said Pinocchio to himself. "Everybody seems far too busy." By this time Pinocchio was feeling very hungry indeed, for he had nothing to eat for 24 hours, and his last meal had only been a dish of green seeds. He realized that there were only 2 ways to get food. He could either beg or try to find some work. He thought it would be easier to try begging first. If the worst came to the worst, he would try to find some sort of job to do. He looked around him and saw a man pulling along 2 great carts loaded with coal. The carts were very heavy, and the man was tired and panting hard. Pinocchio thought that he looked a kind-hearted sort, so he went over to him and said, "Sir, will you please give me a penny for a crust of bread?" "With pleasure," said the man, "if you'll just give me a hand to get these carts home." "I'm not a donkey," said Pinocchio. "I don't pull coal carts." "All right," said the man, "forget it then. If you're really hungry, you can always eat a couple of slices of your pride." Off he went down the street with his carts, and a few minutes later a mason passed by, carrying some sacks of lime on his shoulders. "Excuse me, sir," said Pinocchio. "Would you be so kind as to spare a penny for a poor hungry boy?" "Certainly," said the mason. "Help me with these sacks, and instead of 1 penny, I'll give you 5. "But those sacks are heavy," protested Pinocchio. "I don't want to tire myself out." "Suit yourself," said the mason. "If you don't want to get tired, you'd better sit down and rest. You can amuse yourself by thinking how hungry you are." In less than half an hour, 20 people passed by, and Pinocchio tried to beg a penny from all of them. Each one of them offered him a job, but the puppet turned them all down indignantly. At last a little old woman appeared, carrying 2 pails of water. "Kind lady, would you let me have a drink of water?" asked Pinocchio, who by this time was almost dying of thirst. "Certainly," said the old woman. She put her pails down, and Pinocchio had a long drink. When he had finished, he wiped his mouth and said, "Ah, that's better. Now if only I had something to eat." The old woman said, "If you'll carry one of these pails home for me, I'll give you a nice big piece of bread." Pinocchio looked at the pails doubtfully. "And with the bread," said the old woman, "I'll give you a nice dish of cauliflower with oil and vinegar." Pinocchio was tempted, but he still hesitated. "And after the cauliflower," said the old woman, "you shall have a big dish of tasty sweets." This last temptation was one that Pinocchio could not resist. He said, "All right, I'll do it." He lifted one of the pails and placed it on his head, and the woman led the way down the street. When they arrived at her house, she led Pinocchio into the kitchen and sat him down at the table. Then she brought out a large loaf of bread, a dish of cauliflower with oil and vinegar, and a big plate of delicious-looking sweets. Pinocchio gobbled up the lot. He'd not imagined that it was possible to be so hungry. When he had finished, he sat back with a satisfied sigh, and the old woman smiled at him. "I wish I could eat like that every day," he said. "Don't you get enough to eat at home?" asked the old woman. "I don't have a home any more," said Pinocchio sadly. "I've lost my father, and I've no one to look after me now." The old woman looked at him thoughtfully. "You can stay here if you like," she said kindly. "I've nobody to help me around the house. I could use a strong little boy like you." Suddenly Pinocchio felt almost happy again. "Would you really let me stay here with you?" he said. "I can make myself useful and do all sorts of jobs for you." "That's settled then," said the old woman. "You can start by clearing the table and washing the dishes." "Right," said Pinocchio, and then a sudden thought struck him. He looked at the old lady and said shyly, "Do you mind if I call you Mother?" The old lady smiled. "Yes," she said, "you may call me Mother. I've never had a son of my own. You shall be my son. But you must promise to be a good and obedient son, and go to school and work hard." "Oh, yes, I will," said Pinocchio, forgetting for the moment everything but his pleasure in finding a home again, and one parent at least. "And when I grow up, I'll learn a trade and earn enough money to keep you in comfort for the rest of your life." "Oh, but you'll never grow up," said the old woman. "Never grow up?" said Pinocchio. "Why not?" "Because you're a puppet. Puppets never grow. They're born puppets, they live puppets, and they die puppets." "But I don't want to be a puppet all my life," cried Pinocchio. "I want to be a boy and grow up to be a man." "Well," said the old woman, "you could do that, but only if you deserve it." "And what do I have to do to deserve to become a man?" "It's very easy. You begin by being a good boy." "But I'm a good boy already," Pinocchio protested. "Are you?" said the old lady with a smile. "Well," said Pinocchio, "almost. A good boy works hard and learns his lessons and never tells lies," said his mother. "Yes," said Pinocchio, "and from this day forward I shall do all those things." "Do you promise?" said the old woman. "I promise," said Pinocchio. "I shall be a credit to you and to my poor father." At the thought of old Geppetto, the puppet became sad again. "Will I ever see my father again, do you think?" "I'm sure of it," said the old lady. When Pinocchio heard this, he was so happy that he seized the old lady's hands and kissed them. "Now tomorrow," said the old woman, "you will start by going to school." Pinocchio became a little less happy. "And then you will choose a trade or profession," said his mother. Pinocchio made a wry face. "It rather seems to me," he muttered, "that it's a bit late for me to go to school now." He'd already forgotten his rash promise of a moment ago. "It's never too late to start an education," said the old lady quite sternly. "Do I have to learn a trade or profession?" asked the puppet. "My child," said the old woman, "everybody must have something to do in this world. Everybody must work. Idleness is a dreadful disease, and if it's not cured in childhood, one never gets over it." Pinocchio drew a deep breath and said firmly, "I will study. I will work. I will do everything you tell me, Mother, because I don't want to be a puppet all my life. I want to become a real boy, whatever I have to do for it." "Good," said the old woman, "and remember, it all depends on you." And so the next day Pinocchio went off to school. Over the weeks that followed he went every day, and he soon won the respect and liking of the whole school, and he made many friends. Even the schoolmaster praised him, because he was attentive, studious, and intelligent, the first to arrive at school and the last to leave when school was over. Indeed, his only fault was that he made too many friends. Some of the boys he made friends with were lazy idlers, and both the schoolmaster and his new mother warned him that he should have nothing to do with boys of this sort. "Be careful, Pinocchio," said the schoolmaster one day. "Some of these new friends of yours aren't real friends at all. You'll end up following their example, and they'll only lead you into trouble." Now one day, as he was on his way to school, he met some of these new friends, and one of them said, "Pinocchio, have you heard the news?
"What news?" said the puppet. "The monster whale has been sighted off the beach." Pinocchio's heart skipped a beat when he heard this news, and he thought of poor old Geppetto. "We're on our way to the beach now to see if we can see it," said the other boy. "Are you coming?" "I can't come now," said Pinocchio. "I'm on my way to school." "Oh, you can go to school tomorrow," said the boy. "Surely you can miss a couple of lessons." "But what will the master say?" said Pinocchio. "Let him say what he likes. He's paid to find fault anyway." "And what about my mother?" said the puppet. "How's she going to know, unless you tell her?" "Well, I don't know," said Pinocchio doubtfully. "How long does it take to get to the beach?" "We can be there and back in half an hour." Suddenly Pinocchio made up his mind. "Come on, then," he said. "I'll race you." And at that, all the boys set off at a run across the fields towards the beach. Pinocchio was soon out in front, as he was by far the fastest runner amongst them. And as he ran, he laughed heartily to see the others trying to keep up with him, panting hard and covered with dust and with their tongues hanging out. Pinocchio was naturally the first to arrive at the beach, and he sat down to wait for the others to catch up. The sea was as smooth as a great mirror, and he could see no sign of the whale. When the other boys arrived, out of breath and dishevelled, Pinocchio sprang to his feet and said, "Well, where's the whale? I can't see any sign of him." "Perhaps he's having his breakfast," said one of the boys, and they all laughed. "Or perhaps he hasn't got out of bed yet," said another, and they all laughed again. Pinocchio realized that it was all a joke. There was no whale. He'd been made a fool of. "What's the idea of getting me to come all the way down here on a wild goose chase instead of going to school?" he shouted indignantly. At this, all the boys fell about laughing, and one of them said, "We just wanted you to stay away from school today. We don't like boys who never have their noses out of a book. You show the rest of us up and make us look stupid. We've had just about enough of it." "What's it got to do with you how hard I study?" said the puppet. "You ought to be studying too. You're just a bunch of layabouts. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." At these words the boys stopped laughing and began to mutter angrily. One of the bigger boys came over to Pinocchio and said threateningly, "You'd better be careful what you say. Just you remember there's only one of you and there's 7 of us." "7 silly asses," said Pinocchio, and he laughed. "All right, that does it," said the boy. "Take this and keep it for supper." And with that he aimed a punch at Pinocchio's head. The puppet returned the blow, and immediately the other boys joined in. Soon the fight was fast and furious. Pinocchio was alone, but he defended himself like a hero. His hard wooden feet kept his enemies at a respectful distance. Wherever those feet touched, they left a big black bruise. Seeing they were getting nowhere, the boys began to use other weapons. They unstrapped their school bags and began to throw exercise books and grammars and dictionaries. But the puppet had sharp eyes, and he dodged so quickly that the books all flew over his head into the sea. And then one of the boys picked up a very large book bound in strong board with leather back and corners. It was a treatise on arithmetic, and you can imagine for yourself how heavy that must have been. The boy threw the book with all the strength he could muster, straight at Pinocchio's head. The puppet ducked, and the great book flew over his head. But by this time, instead of falling into the sea, it struck one of the other boys a mighty crack on the head. He turned white as a sheet, staggered, and fell heavily on the sand. There was a moment of silence and stillness as everybody stared at the unmoving figure lying on the beach, and then all the boys turned and ran as fast as their legs could carry them. In a few moments they were all out of sight. Pinocchio wet his handkerchief in the sea and placed it on the boy's forehead. The boy lay there without any signs of life. Suddenly the puppet heard approaching footsteps. He looked up and saw 2 policemen looming over him. "What's going on here?" said one. "I'm helping my schoolmate," said Pinocchio. "What's wrong with him?" "There's been an accident," stammered Pinocchio. "He was hit by a book and he fell over." "Who threw the book?" demanded the first policeman, bending over for a closer look. I don't know, sir," said Pinocchio. "Is this the book?" asked the second policeman, picking it up. "Yes, sir." "Whose book is it?" asked the first policeman. "I don't know," said the puppet. "So you don't know whose book it is or who threw it," said the second policeman. He looked at the first policeman for a moment and then said, "Well, as there doesn't seem to be anybody else around except for you and the victim, I think you'd better come along with us."
Pinocchio began to protest his innocence, but the two policemen grabbed hold of him and marched him up the beach. They stopped when they came to a fisherman's cottage and said to the man at the door, "Go down there and pick up that boy on the beach. Take him into your cottage and do what you can for him. We'll be back in 10 minutes." Then, holding Pinocchio firmly between them, they set off along the shore until they came to a small village. As they walked along the street towards the police station, a gust of wind blew off Pinocchio's cap. "Do you mind if I go and get my cap?" asked the puppet. "All right," said the first policeman, "but be quick about it." Pinocchio walked over to where his cap lay on the ground about 10 yards away. He picked it up, and then, quick as a flash, he began running towards the sea. Instead of chasing after him, the policeman rushed into the station and brought out a very large police dog. They slipped off his leash, and immediately he set off at a great rate after the puppet. Pinocchio ran fast, but the dog ran faster. He was one of the fastest dogs for miles around, and had won first prize in all the local dog races. The puppet could hear the dog panting close behind him. They were separated now by only inches, and Pinocchio could feel the animal's hot breath on his legs. Fortunately, by this time he was on the beach, and it was only a few steps to the sea. As soon as he reached the shore, the puppet gave a mighty jump and landed some yards out in the water. At once he began to swim away from the shore as fast as he could. The dog was coming along behind so fast that he couldn't stop, and he plunged into the water where the waves carried him out to sea. Now the dog couldn't swim, so he pawed desperately, trying to keep his nose above the water. But the more he tried to keep afloat, the more his head kept disappearing beneath the surface, and the further he was carried out to sea. As he felt himself going down for the third time, he gave a despairing bark and shouted, "Help, help! I can't swim!" Pinocchio stopped swimming and looked round. Then he swam quickly back to the dog and said, "If I save your life, will you promise to stop chasing me?" "I promise," spluttered the dog, "but hurry for heaven's sake." Pinocchio still hesitated, but then he remembered his father's saying that no one ever loses by doing a good deed. He swam round the dog, and holding him by the tail with both hands, he pulled him safe and sound to the dry, sandy beach. The poor dog could not stand up. He'd drunk so much salt water that he was blown up like a balloon. However, the puppet did not dare to trust him completely, so he quickly swam out to sea again. As he swam, he called back, "Goodbye, and good luck." "Goodbye," answered the dog. "1,000 thanks for saving my life. One good deed deserves another. I shan't forget." Pinocchio went on swimming, keeping near the shore. At last he spotted what looked to be a safe place. There was a cave among the rocks, with a long column of smoke coming out of it. "There must be a fire in that cave," he said to himself. "I'll be able to dry myself there." He swam over to the rocks. Just as he was climbing out, he felt something rising under the water. It lifted him clean out of the water and onto the beach. He tried to escape, but it was impossible, and he found to his great surprise that he was enmeshed in a large net among a huge number of fish of every shape and size, all flapping and jumping about. At the same time he saw, coming out of the cave, a fisherman who was so ugly that he looked like a sea monster. Instead of hair, his head was covered with a bush of thick green leaves. His skin was green, his eyes were green, his long beard that reached right down to the ground was also green. He looked like a huge green lizard. He was pulling the net out of the sea, and when he'd got it onto the shore, he said, "What a splendid catch! I shall eat well today." He took the net full of fish into the cave. It was dark and smoky in there, and in the middle of the floor was a big frying pan full of boiling oil, which smelled so strongly that it nearly took one's breath away. "Now let's see what I've got here," said the green fisherman. And putting one of his huge hands into the net, he took out a handful of mullet. He smacked his lips and threw them into the frying pan. He repeated this operation several times, pulling out fish of several kinds, whitings, sardines, crabs, anchovies, and they all went straight into the pan. The last in the net was Pinocchio. When the fisherman pulled him out, his eyes opened wide in surprise, and he cried, "What kind of fish is this?
"I've never seen anything quite like this before. It must be some sort of crab."
Pinocchio was quite annoyed at being mistaken for a crab, and he said, "Pardon me, I am not a crab. I'm a puppet."
"A puppet?" said the fisherman. "What kind of a fish is that? I've never tasted puppet fish before, but I'm sure you'll be delicious."
"Will you understand once and for all that I am not a fish?" cried Pinocchio in exasperation. "Have you ever heard of a fish that could talk?"
"No, I haven't," said the fisherman. "You're right, and that being the case, I shall treat you with the greatest consideration. I shall let you choose how you want to be cooked. Would you prefer to be fried in oil in a pan or stewed in tomato sauce?"
"What I would prefer," said Pinocchio, "is to be set free and allowed to go home."
"You must be joking," cried the fisherman. "I don't catch a puppet fish every day, and I'm not going to pass up this chance to see what one tastes like. I shall fry you in the pan with all the other fish. You'll be glad of the company."
He picked up the puppet by the scruff of his neck, and he was just about to throw him into the frying pan when there was a sudden commotion in the mouth of the cave. A large dog came bounding in, wagging his tail and sniffing the air, which was full of the delicious smell of frying fish.
"Get out of here!" yelled the fisherman, aiming a kick at the dog.
But the dog was far too hungry to care about being kicked, and growling at the fisherman, he showed his sharp teeth. At that moment, Pinocchio recognized the dog. It was the same one that had chased him into the sea, and whose life he had saved. In a weak voice he called out, "Save me! The fisherman's going to throw me into the frying pan." The dog at once recognized Pinocchio's voice. He was amazed to see that it came from the bundle in the fisherman's hand. He barked loudly and menacingly, and then jumped up and seized the puppet between his teeth. The fisherman staggered back in alarm, and the dog raced out of the cave carrying Pinocchio very carefully in his mouth. The fisherman recovered quickly and flew into a terrible rage. He chased after the dog, but he had only run a few steps when he was seized with a violent fit of coughing and had to go back into his cave for a glass of water. When the dog came to the road leading to the village, he stopped and placed Pinocchio gently on the ground. "Ah, how can I thank you?" gasped the puppet. "No need to thank me," answered the dog. "You saved my life, and now I've saved yours." "How did you come to the cave?" asked Pinocchio. "I was lying on the sand more dead than alive," said the dog, "when I smelled the odor of frying fish. It made me realize how hungry I was, so I followed it into the cave. It seems I arrived just in time." "Another couple of minutes and I'd have been cooked," said Pinocchio with a shiver. The dog laughed, and even Pinocchio had to smile when he thought of his lucky escape. They shook hands, or in the dog's case, paws, as a sign of friendship, and then they parted. It was quite dark by the time Pinocchio reached home, and he found that the old woman, his adopted mother, was waiting up for him. He told her all that had happened, and when he had finished, he hung his head in shame. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, and then she said, "Pinocchio, I shall forgive you, but this is the very last time. If you ever misbehave again, I shall have nothing more to do with you." Pinocchio vowed and promised that in future he would be good and study hard, and then he went to bed, tired out with his day's adventures. A whole year went by, and Pinocchio kept his word. He was first in the examinations and became the best scholar in the school. And one evening when he arrived home, the old woman said to him, "Pinocchio, tomorrow is a big day for you. Tomorrow your wish will be granted." "My wish?" said the puppet. "Don't you remember?" said his mother. "You said you wanted to be a real boy. Well, tomorrow you shall have your wish. You will no longer be a puppet. You will be a boy." Pinocchio was overjoyed. He ran round the house dancing and singing, and then when he had calmed down, his mother told him that he could invite all his friends and classmates over the following evening for a grand celebration. There would be hot rolls, buttered on both sides, and cakes and tarts and ice cream, and all the lemonade they could drink. Pinocchio begged to be allowed to go at once to the homes of his friends to give them their invitations. His mother said, "All right, but remember to be back before dark." "I promise to be back in 1 hour," said the puppet. "Be careful, Pinocchio. Children make promises very easily," said his mother. "But I'm different from other children," said Pinocchio. "When I say a thing, I mean it." His mother looked at him strangely, but said nothing. The puppet kissed her and ran out of the house, singing and dancing. It took him less than half an hour to call on all his friends and classmates and invite them to the party. Some of them accepted at once with pleasure. Others waited to be urged, but when they heard that there were to be hot rolls and cakes and tarts and ice cream and lemonade, they accepted eagerly. Now Pinocchio had among his schoolmates one favourite of whom he was very fond. His name was Lampwick. He was so called because he was long and thin and very bright, just like a new wick on a lamp. Lampwick was the laziest and most mischievous boy in the school, but Pinocchio liked him just the same. In fact, he called on him first of all, but Lampwick was not at home, and he was still not in when Pinocchio went back a second and again a third time. Pinocchio set out to search for his friend, and at last he found him, hiding under the porch of a peasant's house. "What are you doing there?" asked Pinocchio, creeping under the porch. "I'm waiting for midnight," answered Lampwick. "Why?" said the puppet. "'Cause I'm going away," said his friend. "Where to?" said Pinocchio. "Very far away," said Lampwick mysteriously. "I went to your place 3 times looking for you," said Pinocchio. "I wanted to invite you to my party tomorrow." "I didn't know you were going to have a party," said Lampwick. "Oh, yes, tomorrow I shall no longer be a puppet. I shall be a boy, just like you." "Well, I can't come," said Lampwick. "I told you I'm going away tonight. I'm going away to the most marvellous country you can imagine." "What's it called?" asked Pinocchio. "Playland." "Why don't you come too?" said Lampwick. "Oh, I couldn't do that," said the puppet. "You'll be sorry," said his friend. "There's no better place for boys like us. There's no school there, and no schoolmasters, and no books. No one ever studies or works. There's no school on Saturdays, and there are 6 Saturdays in every week. The autumn holidays begin in January and last till the 31st of December. That's how all civilized countries should be run." "But how do they pass the time?" asked Pinocchio. "Why, they play all day and amuse themselves from morning till night. Then they go to bed and start again the next morning. What do you think of that?" Pinocchio didn't say anything, but there was an expression on his face which seemed to show that he thought that sort of life might not be bad at all. "What about it then?" said Lampwick. "Are you coming or not? Make up your mind." "Is anyone else going with you?" asked Pinocchio. "Oh, yes, there'll be more than 100 of us." "And how are you going to get there? On foot?" "No, there's a stagecoach coming to take us." "When?" said Pinocchio. "At midnight," said Lampwick. "What a pity it's not coming now," said Pinocchio. "Then I could stay and see you off." "Why don't you wait until midnight?" "Oh, I couldn't do that," said Pinocchio. "My mother would wonder what had happened to me." "Ah, well, we couldn't have that, could we?" said Lampwick with a grin. "Are you absolutely sure," said Pinocchio thoughtfully, "that there are no schools in this country?" "Not a single one," said Lampwick. "And no schoolmasters?" "Not one." "And no one ever has to study?" "It's unheard of." "What a beautiful country," sighed Pinocchio. "Of course, I've never been there, but I can imagine what it must be like." "Well, why don't you come along then?" said Lampwick again. "I just can't," said the puppet. "I promised my mother." "Did you say that there's no school on Saturdays, and there are 6 Saturdays in every week?" "Absolutely," said Lampwick. "And holidays begin in January and end on the 31st of December?" "That's it." "What a wonderful country," said Pinocchio delightedly. Then he added quickly and firmly, "Well, goodbye, Lampwick. I hope you have a good journey."
"Sure you won't stay and see us off?" said his friend. "Well," said Pinocchio doubtfully, "midnight, did you say? I suppose, since I've waited this long, an hour more or less wouldn't matter." And so Pinocchio waited for the coach to arrive, and while he waited, Lampwick told him more about the wonderful country of Playland. Meanwhile it grew very dark, and suddenly they saw a little light moving in the distance, and heard bells tinkling, and the chatter of excited voices. Then a horn hooted, very faint and low, like the humming of a wasp. "There it is!" exclaimed Lampwick, jumping to his feet. "It's the coach! This is your last chance, old friend! It's now or never!" "Did you say that nobody ever has to study in Playland?" asked the puppet. "Never," said Lampwick. "What a wonderful country!" cried Pinocchio. "What a really marvellous country!" And then at last the coach arrived. It was drawn by 12 pairs of donkeys, all the same size, but of different colours. Some were grey, some were white, some spotted, and others had blue and yellow stripes. The driver was a small man, broader than he was tall, soft and greasy as butter, with a small face like a red tomato, a soft caressing voice, and a laughing mouth. The coach was already full of boys between 8 and 12 years old, pressed together like salted fish in a barrel. They were crowded and uncomfortable, and they could hardly breathe, but no one complained. The consolation of knowing that in a few hours they would be in a land where there were no books or schools or schoolmasters made them accept anything. After Lampwick had climbed eagerly on top of the coach, the driver said to Pinocchio, "Are you coming too, little man?" "No," said the puppet firmly. "I have to get home. I have to be up early tomorrow to go to school." There was a great shout of laughter from the boys, and the driver shrugged his shoulders, climbed up into the driving seat. He cracked his whip, and the coach began very slowly to move off. And then a most peculiar thing happened. Pinocchio rushed forward, shouting, "Wait! Wait for me!" The driver pulled hard on the reins, and the coach stopped. "So you've decided to come after all," he smiled. "Yes," said Pinocchio eagerly. "Yes, I'm coming." "Well, there's no room on the coach," said the driver. "You'd better ride on one of the donkeys. Climb on that one there." Pinocchio went up to the donkey nearest to the coach, harnessed to the right-hand shaft. Just as he was about to climb on, the donkey kicked out with its hind legs and sent him sprawling. The driver lashed out with his whip, and the donkey squealed in pain. Pinocchio tried again, and again the donkey sent him flying with a well-aimed kick. This time the driver gave the animal several sharp cuts with the whip. "Try again," he shouted. "I think you'll find he'll be a little better behaved this time." And sure enough, the donkey stood quite still while Pinocchio climbed onto his back. The driver's whip whistled, and the coach set off once more. But as it picked up speed, Pinocchio heard a thin little voice close to him saying, "You poor fool! You'll be sorry. You'll be very, very sorry." To his surprise and alarm, he realized that it was the donkey that had spoken. They arrived at Playland just as the sun was rising the next morning, and Pinocchio was delighted to find that it was everything that he'd expected. The population consisted entirely of children. The eldest was 14, and the youngest was just 8 years old. The shouting and laughing and merriment in the streets was deafening. There were children everywhere. Some were playing skittles, some ball games, some cycling, some were riding on wooden horses. Others were playing blind man's buff. Some were dressed as clowns and turning somersaults or walking on their hands. Others were trundling hoops about or playing soldiers. Then there was laughing and shouting and hand-clapping. There were theatres crowded all day long in every open space. Immediately they got inside the city, Lampwick and Pinocchio and all the other boys hurried to join the other children, and very soon they were enjoying themselves without a care in the world. And so 6 months passed in this happy country, 6 months of games and laughter, with no school, no books, and no studies.
And then one morning Pinocchio woke up and had a very unpleasant surprise. He found when he looked in the mirror that his ears had grown several inches and had sprouted little hairs at the tops. In fact, he thought with horror, they seemed to be exactly like the ears of a donkey. As he went downstairs, Pinocchio met the landlord of the house in which he was staying. The man stared at him for a moment, and then shook his head sadly and said with a grim smile, "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. What a shame. Another case of donkey fever." Pinocchio was very alarmed at this news. "I never heard of donkey fever before," he said. "What is it?" "It's what you've got," said the landlord. "In a few hours you will no longer be a puppet. You'll be a donkey, a real donkey, like those that draw carts and carry vegetables to the market. There's nothing you can do about it. All lazy children who spend their whole time playing games and amusing themselves end up, sooner or later, by becoming little donkeys. It's no use crying about it now. You should have thought about it before it was too late." "But it's not my fault," cried Pinocchio. "It's all because of Lampwick." "Who is Lampwick?" asked the landlord. "One of my schoolmates," said the puppet. "See, I wanted to go home. I wanted to go back to school and study hard. But Lampwick said, 'Why bother with school? Come with us to Playland. There are no schools there. You can play games and enjoy yourself all day long.'" "Why did you listen to him?" asked the landlord. "Because I'm stupid and foolish," cried Pinocchio. "If only I hadn't listened to Lampwick, I could have been a real boy by now." He was so upset that he ran back up to his room and locked the door. He looked in the mirror and saw that his ears had now grown several inches and looked exactly like the ears of a donkey. He couldn't bear to look at them, so he found a large cotton cap and pulled it over his head right down to his nose. He decided to go and find Lampwick, so he rushed down the stairs and out into the streets. When he came to his friend's house, he knocked on the door, and a voice from inside called, "Who's there?" It was Lampwick. "It's me, Pinocchio," said the puppet. "Just a minute," said Lampwick. "I'll come down and let you in." The door opened a few inches, and Pinocchio went inside. As they went up to Lampwick's room, Pinocchio saw to his great surprise that his friend was also wearing a great cotton cap over his head. Pinocchio thought to himself, "I wonder if Lampwick has donkey fever too." However, he pretended not to notice anything and said cheerfully, "How are you, my dear Lampwick?" "Very well," said his friend. "I like your cap," said the puppet casually. "Yes," said Lampwick. "I have to wear it for medical reasons. The doctor ordered it. You see, I've hurt my knee. I notice you're wearing one too." "Yes," said Pinocchio. "I hurt my leg." The two friends looked knowingly at each other. Then Pinocchio said, "Lampwick, have you by any chance had any trouble with your ears?" "My ears?" said Lampwick. "Certainly not. Why, have you?" "Oh, no," answered Pinocchio, "except that one of my ears was aching a bit this morning." "Ah," said Lampwick, "it's funny you should say that. I've got the same trouble." "Which ear is it?" asked the puppet. "Well, it's both of them, actually," said his friend. "What about you?" "Me too," said Pinocchio. "Do you think we might possibly both have the same sickness?" "It's quite possible," said Lampwick. "Will you do me a great favour, Lampwick?" asked Pinocchio. "With the greatest of pleasure." "Will you let me see your ears?" "Why not, if you let me see yours." "All right," said Pinocchio. "You first." "Oh, no, my dear fellow, no. You first, and then I'll show you mine." "I tell you what," said Pinocchio, "we'll take off our caps together. Agreed?" "Agreed," said Lampwick. "Right," said the puppet. "Here goes, then. 1, 2, 3. The two of them removed their caps in the same instant and threw them up into the air. And then, when Pinocchio and Lampwick saw each other's long donkey ears, they both burst out laughing. They laughed and laughed until they nearly exploded. But suddenly Lampwick stopped laughing. He staggered and grew pale. Then he gasped and said, "Pinocchio, I can't stand up straight."
"Neither can I," stammered Pinocchio. And now the two friends found themselves on all fours. They ran round the room in a panic, and as they ran their hands and feet gradually changed into hoofs, and their faces grew longer and longer, and they found that they were covered all over in light grey hair with black spots, and then finally each saw that the other had a long tail. When they saw this, the boys realized that they had both really changed into donkeys, and they cried out in shame and horror. But instead of human voices, the sounds they made were those of two donkeys braying. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and a loud voice called out, "Open up in there!" Of course, neither Pinocchio nor Lampwick were able to open the door with their hooves, so they did nothing. With a crash the door burst open, and there stood the driver of the coach that had brought them to Playland. "I recognized your voices at once," he said with a smile. And then he pulled from his pocket a large comb, such as is used for grooming horses, and he combed their coats carefully. When they were so shiny that he could see his face in them, he produced two bridles and slipped them over their heads. He led the two donkeys downstairs and out into the street, and from there he took them along to the nearest market. Pinocchio now realized that the driver of the coach was not the pleasant, kind-hearted man he appeared to be. He was, in fact, a cruel monster who travelled everywhere with his coach, collecting children who did not like school and studies. With promises and flattery, he persuaded them to go along with him to Playland, to a land where they could enjoy themselves without a care in the world. And then, when they changed into donkeys, which inevitably happened, he took them to market and sold them. He had been doing this for so long and had made so much money out of it that he was now a millionaire. When they arrived at the market, there were plenty of people willing to buy. Lampwick was sold immediately to a farmer whose donkey had died the day before, and a little later Pinocchio was bought by the manager of a circus. And so Pinocchio found himself living the hard life of a donkey. It was the circus manager's intention to put him in the show, and for the next few months the puppet was kept busy learning tricks. He had to jump through a hoop, breaking the paper with his head. He had to learn how to dance the waltz and the polka, and he had to master the difficult trick of walking round the circus ring on his hind legs. At last the day arrived when Pinocchio was due to make his first appearance in the circus ring. Gaily coloured posters were put up on all the street corners reading, "Grand full dress performance, announcing the first appearance of the little donkey Pinocchio." The theatre was full an hour before the opening of the show. Not one more seat could have been bought, even for its weight in gold. The seats round the ring were packed with girls and boys, impatient to see the famous little donkey, Pinocchio, and the only dancing donkey in the circus. After the first part of the show, the ringmaster came forward. He was wearing a black coat with white tights and boots reaching above his knees. He made a deep bow and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are proud to present, making his very first appearance in the ring, Pinocchio, the dancing donkey." There was a roar of applause, and Pinocchio trotted into the ring. The ringmaster cracked his whip and said, "Before you start your performance, Pinocchio, salute this distinguished audience." Pinocchio obediently bent his knees and remained kneeling until the ringmaster cracked his whip again and shouted, "Walk!" Then the little donkey got up and walked round the ring. After a while the ringmaster shouted, "Trot!" Pinocchio obeyed the order and started to trot. "Gallop!" shouted the ringmaster, and Pinocchio broke into a gallop. "Run!" shouted the ringmaster, and Pinocchio ran as fast as he could. Suddenly, while he raced around the ringmaster raised his arm in the air and fired off a pistol. Immediately Pinocchio fell over and lay still, pretending to be dead. The applause was deafening and continued for several minutes. "Now," shouted the ringmaster, "show the audience how elegantly you can leap through the hoop." A large hoop was held up in the centre of the ring, and Pinocchio ran towards it. But when he reached it, he faltered, and instead of jumping through it, he ran under it. The crowd roared with laughter. 3 times Pinocchio ran at the hoop, and each time he ducked under it instead of jumping through it.
and then at the fourth attempt he gave a mighty leap and jumped. But he had mistimed his jump, and his right hind leg caught in the edge of the hoop as he sailed through it. He fell heavily to the ground on the other side. When he got up, he found he was lame, and could walk back to the stable only with great difficulty. He did not appear in the ring again that evening. When the veterinary surgeon saw him the next morning, he declared that he would stay lame for the rest of his life. And so Pinocchio's short career in the circus came to an abrupt end. The owner of the circus was very annoyed. He had now a useless donkey on his hands. He told the stable boy to take Pinocchio down to the market and sell him for the best price he could get. Although the market was busy and crowded, no one wanted to buy a lame donkey, and several hours went by before a man came up and said to the stable boy, "How much do you want for this lame donkey?" 5 crowns, said the boy. "I'll give you 5 pence, said the man. "That's all he's worth. I'm only buying him for his skin. I'm making a drum for the village band, and his skin will come in useful." As soon as the 5 pence was paid, the new owner led the little donkey down to the seashore and tied a long rope to one of his legs. Then he found a large rock and tied that around the donkey's neck. Then he led him up to the top of a cliff and gave Pinocchio a sudden push. Pinocchio, with the heavy stone tied to his neck, went down with a rush and struck the water with a great splash. Meanwhile, his new owner held the rope attached to his leg and waited. As soon as Pinocchio had drowned, he would pull him out again and take him home and skin him. Pinocchio sank straight to the bottom, weighted down by the heavy stone. The owner waited about half an hour, and then said to himself, "Well, he must be drowned by now. It's time to pull him up." He began hauling in the rope he had tied to the donkey's leg. He hauled, and at last something broke the surface of the water. But to his intense astonishment, it wasn't the donkey he had thrown over the cliff. It was a puppet, a real live puppet, wriggling like an eel. When he saw the wooden puppet, the poor man thought he must be dreaming. He stood there with his mouth open and his eyes starting out of his head. When he had recovered a little, he stammered, "Where's my donkey? What's happened to him?" "I'm the donkey," cried Pinocchio. "What do you mean you're the donkey?" said the man. "You're a puppet." "But I was a puppet before I was changed into a donkey," said Pinocchio. "Now I've changed back into a puppet. And do you know why? Because while I was down there at the bottom of the sea, I had time to think about everything that had happened to me. I realized what a fool I'd been. I remembered all the good resolutions I'd made and broken. I understood how I'd been led astray and let people down, and I resolved there and then that if I came out of this alive, I'd mend my ways and try to undo some of the damage I'd done. And as soon as I had made up my mind, I changed back into a puppet, and of course, being only made of wood, I couldn't drown." "That's the most ridiculous nonsense I've ever heard," shouted the man angrily. "Nevertheless, it's all quite true," said Pinocchio. "Well, true or not," said the man, "I've paid 5 pence for you, and I want my money back. I'll take you back to the market and sell you for firewood." "Sell me if you like," cried Pinocchio, "but you'll have to catch me first." And with that, he slipped easily out of the rope around his leg and swam out to sea as fast as he could. In the twinkling of an eye, he was so far away he was hardly visible. In fact, there was only a black dot on the water when he now and then lifted an arm or a leg, or jumped about like a joyful dolphin. Pinocchio swam on for hours. His heart was full of joy, neither knowing nor caring where he was going. The sun was high in the heavens, and he turned over on his back and floated along lazily, basking in the warm rays. And then suddenly he heard a sort of rushing sound, as if something were travelling very fast through the water. He turned over and looked around him, scanning the horizon. At first he could see nothing, but the rushing sound grew louder and louder, and then he noticed a disturbance in the water, quite far off, but coming rapidly nearer. Closer and closer it came, and louder grew the noise, and then Pinocchio could see, to his intense horror, just what it was that was rushing towards him. It was the great whale, the monster of the deep which he had heard so much about but never seen, and here it was, bearing down on him with the speed of an express train. Now it was no more than 100 yards away, and he could see its great gaping mouth like a deep cave, with 3 rows of huge, sharp-pointed teeth. Pinocchio turned and started to swim desperately, but the giant whale was much, much faster, and the gap between them closed with frightening rapidity. The puppet summoned up every ounce of strength and splashed through the water panic-stricken. Behind him the monster fish bore down, with the sea curving out on each side of his enormous body in great waves. Closer and closer he came, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, 1 foot, 6 inches, and then with a gigantic gulp the whale swallowed the tiny puppet, and Pinocchio disappeared into the gaping jaws. Down and down he went into the blackness, down, down and down, until he landed with a thump in the creature's vast stomach. He struck the bottom with such a crack that he lost consciousness, and he lay there, a tiny figure in the wet darkness. When he came to himself, Pinocchio had no idea where he was. All around him it was very dark. The darkness was so thick and deep that he felt as if he had dived head first into a bottle of ink. He listened, but he could hear nothing. From time to time strong gusts of wind blew into his face. At first he couldn't make out where the wind was coming from, but then he realized it was coming from the monster's lungs. At first Pinocchio tried to be brave, but when he realized that he was inside the whale's body, he broke down and cried in despair. Suddenly a voice said, "What are you crying for?" Pinocchio looked up startled. "Who's there?" he said. "Me," said the voice. "Who's me?" said Pinocchio. "I'm a tunny fish," said the voice. "I was swallowed at the same time as you were. What sort of fish are you?" "I'm not a fish," said Pinocchio. "I'm a puppet." "Then it serves you right," said the voice. "Puppets have no business swimming about in the middle of the sea." "How do we get out of here?" said Pinocchio. "We don't," said the tunny fish. "We just sit here and wait for the whale to digest us." "But I don't want to be digested," cried Pinocchio. "I want to escape." "I'm not stopping you," said the fish. "This whale that swallowed us, is he very big?" asked the puppet. "His body's just over a mile long, not counting the tail," said the fish. "A mile?" said Pinocchio in amazement. "And is it as dark as this everywhere?" "As far as I know," said the fish, "it's completely dark right the way through." "Well, that's where you're wrong," said Pinocchio. "I can see a glimmer of light." "Where?" said the fish. "Way down there," said Pinocchio, pointing. "Have you any idea what it might be?" "Not the slightest," said the fish. "I think I'll go and see if I can find out what it is," said Pinocchio. "Suit yourself," said the fish. "Good luck to you." Pinocchio started feeling his way through the darkness towards that dim, flickering light in the distance. As he walked, he found the going easier, because the light grew brighter and showed the way ahead. At last he reached the light, and he nearly fell over in surprise. In front of him was a small table, with a tablecloth and cutlery and crockery, and a lighted candle stuck in a green glass bottle. And sitting at the table was an old man eating some fish. Pinocchio's heart skipped a beat, for the old man was none other than his long-lost father, Geppetto. Pinocchio wanted to laugh and cry and say thousands of things, but all he could manage was, "Father! Oh, Father!" And he threw his arms around the old man's neck and hugged him. "Is it really you, my boy?" said the old Geppetto in amazement. "I never thought I'd set eyes on you again." "Neither did I," said Pinocchio. "Oh, Father, the things I've been through, the adventures I've had. I thought I'd lost you forever when you set out to sea in that tiny boat. I waved and shouted and—" "Yes, I saw you," said the old man. "I tried to row back to the shore." "What happened?" said Pinocchio. "The waves were so rough that I couldn't make it," said the old man. "And then my boat capsized and I was thrown into the water. Luckily I managed to cling on to a piece of wood, but I was swept far out to sea. I thought it was all over for me, but suddenly this great whale appeared on the scene and swallowed me whole." "But that was ages ago," said Pinocchio. "Do you mean you've been down here all this time?"
"Yes," said Geppetto. "I've lost track of time, but it must be at least a year, I suppose."
"But how have you managed to live?" said the puppet. "Where did the table come from, and the crockery, and the cutlery, and the candle? How did you find matches to light it with?"
"Well," said Geppetto, "that storm that capsized my boat also wrecked a big merchant ship. The sailors all managed to get ashore, but the ship floated out to sea and the whale swallowed it."
"He swallowed the whole ship?" cried Pinocchio.
"Yes, all but the mainmast. He spat that out because it stuck in his teeth like a fishbone. Anyway, luckily for me, the ship was full of cans of preserved meat, biscuits, bottles of wine, cheese, coffee, and other provisions."
"And that's what you lived on all the time?" said Pinocchio.
"Yes," said Geppetto, "but now my supplies are exhausted. There's nothing left in the pantry. That candle on the table there is the very last one."
"In that case," said Pinocchio, "we have no time to lose. We must find a way to escape at once."
"There's only one way out of here," said Geppetto, "and that's through the mouth of the whale."
"Then that's the way we'll go," said Pinocchio.
"There's only one trouble," said the old man. "I can't swim."
"Don't worry about that," said Pinocchio. "I'm a good swimmer. I'll carry you on my back." Geppetto shook his head sadly.
"It's no use, my boy. A puppet like you, only 3 foot tall, wouldn't be strong enough to swim with a fully grown man on his back."
"It's the only way," said Pinocchio. "Come on, we'll take this candle and start off at once. Follow me, and don't be afraid." The two of them set off towards where they hoped the whale's mouth was situated. Pinocchio hoped that they were going the right way. Luckily, he had guessed right, and after about half an hour they found themselves at the whale's throat. They stopped to consider the situation. They had to seize the exact moment to make their escape, and that had to be when the whale's mouth was open. Unfortunately, it was tightly closed. Now the whale was very old, and he suffered from asthma and palpitations of the heart. This meant he had to sleep with his mouth open. As it happened, he was just on the point of settling down for the night when Pinocchio and Geppetto arrived at his throat, so it wasn't too long before his jaws started to sag, and they could see a strip of starry sky and a big bright moon. "Come on," whispered Pinocchio. "Now's our chance. The sea is smooth, and it's as bright as day outside." They climbed up cautiously into the whale's mouth and tiptoed quietly past the enormous teeth. When they came to the edge of the mouth, Pinocchio whispered, "Climb on my back, father, and hang on tight. I'll do the rest." As soon as Geppetto was on his back, Pinocchio jumped into the sea and began to swim. The sea was as smooth as oil. The moon shone brightly, and the whale slept on so soundly that the firing of a cannon would not have disturbed him. Pinocchio swam on as quickly as he could, but after a time Geppetto said,
"Pinocchio, I don't see any land."
"Don't worry, father," gasped Pinocchio. "We'll come to it sooner or later." And he swam on bravely, growing weaker and weaker. After what seemed a very long time, he began to slow down, and at last he came to a dead stop. "I'm exhausted, father," he panted. "I can't swim another stroke."
"Then we're done for," said old Geppetto. "Goodbye, my son. Remember, I've always loved you."
And then suddenly a voice close by said,
"What's all this about, then?"
"Who's that?" gasped Pinocchio.
"It's me, the tunnyfish," said the voice. "We met in the whale's stomach, remember?"
"Oh, yes," said the puppet. "How did you escape?"
"Same way as you. I was right behind you. I would never have found the way out if it hadn't been for you."
"It's good to see you," said Pinocchio. "Do you happen to know if we're close to land?"
"Oh, yes," said the fish. "It's quite close. It's about 4 or 5 minutes hard swimming."
"I don't think I can make it," said Pinocchio weakly. "I'm just about done."
"Catch hold of my tail," said the fish. "I'll tow you in. We'll be there in no time at all."
Geppetto and Pinocchio accepted the invitation without having to be asked again. They grabbed hold of the fish's tail, and off he went at a great rate, towing them behind with no effort at all. When they reached the shore, the fish swam right up to the beach and deposited his 2 passengers in an exhausted heap on the sands.
"I can't thank you enough," said Pinocchio. "You've saved our lives."
The tunny fish was so embarrassed by these words that he just smiled and then dived back into the water and disappeared. By this time the sun was coming up. Pinocchio gave his arm to Geppetto, who was so weak that he could hardly stand. "Come on, father," he said. "We'll walk along slowly, and when we're tired we'll stop and rest."
Where are we going?" asked old Geppetto.
"We'll try to find a house where we can ask for a bit of bread and some straw to make a bed," said the puppet. They walked inland for about half an hour, and then they came to a small cottage. Pinocchio knocked on the door, and a small voice from inside said, "Who is it?" "A poor father and his poor son with no bread and no home," said Pinocchio. "Turn the key and the door will open," said the voice. Pinocchio turned the key and the door opened. They went in and looked around but saw nobody, and then the voice said, "Here I am, up here." They looked up toward the roof, and there, sitting on a little crossbeam, was the talking cricket. "Oh, it's you," said Pinocchio. "How are you, my dear cricket?" "So I'm your dear cricket now, am I?" said the insect. "Do you remember how you chased me from your home by throwing a hammer at me?" Oh, yes, I remember," said Pinocchio. I'm sorry about that. Well, I suppose we'd better be on our way." "Not so fast," said the cricket. "I didn't say I wouldn't help you. I just wanted to show you that you should treat people kindly in this world. You never know when you may want a favor yourself." "You're right," said Pinocchio. "You're absolutely right. It's a lesson I shan't forget. Tell me, my dear cricket, where can I get a cup of milk for my poor father?" "Giangio, the gardener, lives about 3 fields away from here. He has some cows. He might give you some milk." "Thank you," said Pinocchio. "I'm very grateful to you," and off he ran at once to the gardener's house. When the puppet asked him if he had any milk to spare, the gardener said, "How much do you want?" "A cupful," said the puppet. "A cup of milk costs a penny," said Giangio. "Have you got a penny?" "I haven't even got a farthing," said Pinocchio sadly. "Too bad," said Giangio. Pinocchio turned dejectedly away, but the gardener said, "Wait a minute. Perhaps we can work something out. Will you turn that windlass for me?" "What's a windlass?" asked Pinocchio. "A machine that carries up water from the well," said Giangio. "Well, I'll try," said Pinocchio. Giangio took the puppet into the garden and showed him how to turn the windlass. Pinocchio started at once, but before he had drawn up half a dozen buckets, he was perspiring from head to foot. He'd never worked so hard in his life. "It was my donkey's work until today," said the gardener, "but the poor beast is dying." "May I go and see him?" asked Pinocchio. "Certainly." Pinocchio went into the stable and saw a poor old donkey lying on the straw. He was dying of hunger and hard work. Pinocchio bent closer, and the donkey opened its eyes weakly, and then the puppet gave a gasp. "I know you," he said. "What's your name?" "Lampwick," said the donkey in a very weak voice, and then he closed his eyes and passed away. "Oh, my poor Lampwick," murmured Pinocchio, and he took some straw and wiped away the tears that were running down his cheeks. From that day on, Pinocchio got up before dawn every morning to turn the windlass so as to earn the cup of milk for his father. But that was not all. In his spare time, he learned how to weave baskets of reeds. With the money he earned, they had enough to pay for all their needs. When evening came, he practiced reading and writing. Because of his ingenuity and diligence, his father, whose health was still very bad, was able to live quite comfortably. Even though he was not able to go to school because he was working hard all day, he soon learned to read and write. And then one day, after 2 years had passed, Pinocchio got up one morning and looked in the mirror. Instead of a wooden puppet, he saw the face of a young boy with brown hair and blue eyes and strong arms and legs. He let out a cry of joy and ran into his father's room. "Father, look!" he shouted. "I'm not a puppet any longer. I'm a real boy." "Yes, my boy," said Geppetto. "It was bound to happen sooner or later. You have worked hard and studied hard. You have mended your ways, and so now you have become a boy instead of a wooden puppet." "Thank you, Father," said Pinocchio. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. I'm so happy that everything's worked out for the best." And to make Pinocchio's happiness complete, exactly 1 year to the day when he had become a real boy, he was reunited with the old woman who had been his mother by adoption. She had been searching for him all this time, and when they were together at last, Pinocchio's joy knew no bounds.